Many features and decisions of the Cataclysm expansion have been controversial, but WoW's third expansion was also not without its positives. Today, we're looking at over 10 different things that made WoW a better game that were added in Cataclysm. And at number 10, we have Void Storage. Implemented in patch 4.3, Void Storage serves as an alternative to the traditional bank. Run by Vault Keepers, Void Storage in lore is made possible by Ethereals using Technomancy, which allows players to deposit some of their items in a pocket dimension. Originally, Void Storage had 80 slots, but that was doubled to 116 Warlords of Draenor. To access Void Storage, players must pay a 100 gold fee once per each character. Depositing items into Void Storage cost 25 gold in Cata, but was later lowered to 10 in WoD. Void Elves actually receive a 50% discount on transactions at Void Storage due to their racial passive ethereal connections. Void Storage was initially almost exclusively used for transmog, but we'll get to that later. There are two main advantages to Void Storage. First, it can save up space in both the player's bags and the regular bank. Second, Void Storage is account-wide, meaning any character can access it once they have paid the 100 gold fee. However, Void Storage is at number 10 on this list because it has so many disadvantages as well, which result in Void Storage feeling pretty underwhelming and frustrating. Most of these disadvantages have to deal with the stuff you actually can put into Void Storage, or more accurately, stuff that you can't put into Void Storage. First, players can only place soulbound items into Void Storage. They cannot also deposit unique items, items that are stackable, or any items that are common or poor quality. Items must be also fully repaired before they can be deposited. Additionally, any items placed into the storage will lose all customizations, including enchants, gems, additional sockets, reforged stats, and creator tags on crafted items. This is because the storage system only keeps a record of the item's ID number, for the sake of technical efficiency. Finally, there are just very few Void Storage locations in the game. As a Dragonflight, there are only 10 in the entire game, with most being in major cities. All of these downsides quickly add up and place Void Storage at only number 10 on this list. Up next, number 9, we have the updates to cities. Both Stormwind and Orgrimmar received massive updates in Cataclysm, including a total revamp and additional areas in both cities being added. The Stormwind Outskirts and Cemetery were added in Stormwind, while Orgrimmar was also greatly expanded with the Valley of Honor update and now having a backdoor to Ajara. Both capitals also received little portal areas for the new Cataclysm zones, which are the Throne of Elements in Orgrimmar and Earthshrine in Stormwind. There are simply so many things to list and go over with complete revamps of both cities that we can't include them on this list. However, we did do a mini review of all these changes in the video covering the changes to Stormwind and Orgrimmar over the years, which can be found in a linked video in the description below if you want to check it out. While the city updates in Cata were great, they were more world building and in the background and largely lost the mechanics of WoW's gameplay. Of course, we appreciate them, but there are far more larger and cooler things added in Cata, so the city updates only land at number 9 on our list. And at number 8, we have another update, this time to every zone from vanilla. In part to allow old world flying, and in part to update leveling and lore, almost every single zone throughout both Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor was entirely revamped. This included new quests, new NPCs, and new flight paths. Additionally, Deathwing's edgy emo-ness radically altered the landscapes in some zones, such as Thousand Needles, and even split some zones up like the Barrens and the Cape of Stranglethorn. The sheer scope of such a task is not to be understated, and this effort was probably one of the biggest, if not the largest projects the WoW devs have ever done. In total, there were 36 zones which were updated in Cata, with 16 in Kalimdor and 20 in the Eastern Kingdoms. And all of this is, of course, in addition to the 5 new zones Cata added: Deepholm, Mount Hyjal, Tol Barad, Twilight Highlands, and Uldum. Additionally, don't forget Cata saw the introduction of goblins and worgens to the game, so Cataclysm also added the city of Kazan, the Lost Isles, and Gilneas to the game. Overall, this was an insane undertaking, and the Old World Revamp definitely deserves a spot on this list. And at number 7, we have the often forgotten Tabard reputation system, which was significantly expanded in Cataclysm. The Tabard slot had been in the game since vanilla, but its only real function was to show off the player's achievements. This switch to Rep Tabard started in Wrath, but it was only for the Northrend factions. When equipped, these tabards let the player gain reputation while doing dungeons. Specifically, the player champions their cause according to the tooltip on the tabard. In Cataclysm, the old city tabards were updated and new tabards were added for the Cataclysm reps. Players no longer had to go to Northrend and complete the Argent tournament for rep tabards. Instead, players could go to their main city for whatever rep they wanted and just buy a tabard from vendors called quartermasters for a few silver. In Cata, there were 12 main rep tabards for races and cities, with 6 for each of the base races that made up the factions at the time of Cata. For Alliance, there was the Exodar tabard, which can be purchased in the Exodar, and the Stormwind tabard, which can be purchased, unsurprisingly, from Stormwind. Both the Ironforge tabard and Nomergon tabards can be purchased in Ironforge, and both the Darnassus and Gilneas tabards can be bought in Teldrassil. For Horde, the Undercity Tabard can be bought in Undercity, Silvermoon Tabard can be bought outside of Silvermoon, and the Thunderbluff Tabard can be bought in Thunderbluff. The other 3 tabards for Orgrimmar, Darkspear, and Bilgewater Cartel could all be bought atop the Central Plateau area in Orgrimmar. Not only were these tabards great for reaching max rep with older factions, but Blizzard also introduced them for the new factions in Cataclysm. We already mentioned Gilneas and the Bilgewater Cartel, but tabards were also added for the Guardians of Hyjal, the Earthen Ring, Therazane, Ramikon, and the Wildhammer Dragonmaw clans. Cataclysm had the easiest way to get reputation in the history of the entire game, and it seems Blizzard thought it was simply too OP since they've never gone back to the tabard system of rep. What made this system so great is that it knocked out 2 birds with 1 stone. Players need to rep with factions, and they need to run dungeons to get better gear. However, the main reason this was the case back then and not today is because reputations didn't really matter that much. Nowadays, Blizzard tries to make reputations give actual useful rewards and go beyond Exalted, so being able to grind it infinitely in dungeons with a tabard doesn't really fit the current rep philosophy. And at number 6, we have interactive phasing. Interactive phasing is when open world and zone changes reflect the player's actions. Usually this happens after a major quest in a zone, but in the example we'll focus on the Molten Front. When players first arrive in the Molten Front offensive in the prequel to the Firelands Raise, it's barren and has few friendly NPCs there. However, over time as the player does dailies and activities, they help establish a foothold and help Malfurion grow a tree. This tree starts out and then goes through phases and becomes a sapling and then grows larger and larger. Along the way, the players unlock new areas and quests in the Molten Front. More NPCs come and Druid army actually starts to form. While the Molten Front does have its fair share of problems, launching an all-out assault on Ragnaros and seeing the updates in the war campaign actually happen before your eyes is certainly what stuck with a lot of people. Gameplay-wise, it helps feel like the player is actually accomplishing something, and it significantly heightens the personal investment and the role-playing perspective. Seeing a real impact the player's characters have caused in the world is not only its own reward, but it keeps the player engaged in a fun, creative way and not in a doled-out, drip-fed manner. While it may seem minor, interactive phasing can also raise the stakes and storytelling within the game. For example, most Worgen players who leveled through Gilneas will probably remember that half the island slid into the sea, just after the player had spent several minutes questing through the area. Because of this new interactive phasing introduced in Cataclysm, it added a new depth to quest and immersion, and ultimately makes the player care more about the world. Speaking of the Molten Front, at number 5 we have the Firelands raid. This raid in particular was popular amongst the player base, as its final boss is Ragnaros. Ragnaros is one of WoW's most iconic villains, and this is the second time players defeat him, the first time being after he was banished from the Molten Core in Vanilla. We could spend an entire video discussing the unique boss encounters, tactics, and layouts of this raid, but most of that is beyond the scope of this video. We'll give a few examples of some of the more unique bosses, such as climbing the spider webs in the Beltalak encounter, or trying to even out DPS on Lord Rylith. Shanox is also one of the few summonable bosses in a raid in the entire game, as he only appears after clearing a certain amount of trash ads. Almost every boss in the entire raid is memorable, which is quite a feat indeed given how many instances there are in World of Warcraft. It speaks volumes that the time walking raid Blizzard introduced with Cataclysm time walking was the Firelands. Blizzard knew how much players like Firelands, and Dragonsoul is certainly a mixed bag. Blizzard could have also chosen Bastion of Twilight, but they knew most players were more fond of Firelands, and it's pretty easy to see why. We've just barely scratched the surface of the raid in all of its unique moments and mechanics and lore and loots and mounts, but suffice to say that Firelands is pretty lit. And at number 4, we have all the new races and new race class combinations added in Cataclysm. Players certainly like to customize their character, and Cataclysm gave them many new options to do so. Of course, right off the bat, most players will know the 2 new playable races were added in the game in Cataclysm, which are the Worgen for Alliance and Goblins for the Horde. When Cataclysm launched, Worgens could be played as Druid, Hunter, Mage, Priest, Rogue, Warlock, Warrior, and Death Knights. Goblins could play the same classes, but with the exception they could not play as Druids, but could play as Shamans. Many other race class combinations were also added in Cataclysm, which most players don't know. We'll start out with the Alliance. In Cataclysm, dwarves were now allowed to be mages, shamans, and warlocks. Priests, gnomes, and human hunters were also introduced in Cata. For Horde, orc mages and undead hunters were added. Trolls got 2 new classes with druids and warlocks, and Taurens could be paladins and priests. And finally, Blood Elf warriors were also added. While this may seem like a bit of a hodgepodge, Blizzard made it this easy to mostly preserve the balance amongst the classes of the 2 different factions. For instance, Worgen could be druids, so now trolls could be druids to even it out. Goblin shamans were added, so dwarf shamans were added. Dwarf mages were added, so orc mages were added. You get the idea. Overall, Cataclysm saw the most changes to the game's race class combinations, with 30 new race class combos being added. That's a lot of new animations and work and a large undertaking in of itself. The look and feel of the player's characters was much more customizable in Cataclysm, and so all the new race class combos take the 4th spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Reforging. Introduced in Cata, players could talk to arcane reforges to modify a piece of gear's secondary stats. This allowed for much more customization suitable to the player's game style and helped alleviate needless RNG runs. Reforging an item costs the same amount as its sell value. There were 2 downsides to Reforging though. The first being that the 4 primary stats, agility, intellect, stamina, and strength, were not able to be reforged. The second is that no stats can be added to a piece that already had a secondary stat. That is, players could not double dip and gain 2 kinds of the same secondary stat. There were 8 secondary stats that could be reforged in Cataclysm, which included critical strike, dodge, expertise, haste, hit, mastery, parry, and spirit. Reforging was so useful, Blizzard even added a vendor and an arcane reforger on a mountain Mist of Pandaria. Mystic Birdhat and the Grand Expedition Yak was originally an arcane reforger before it became a transmogrifier. Blizzard did eventually remove the reforge system entirely from the game Worlds of Draenor, but remnants of it can be seen in the missives used to customize secondary stats in the Shadowlands and Dragon Isle professions. One cannot understate the importance of gear in WoW. Being able to more finely tune gear to niche specializations was a fine addition to the game, and one that is sorely missed. Blizzard said the reason they removed reforging was because they wanted people to be able to use their gear as soon as they got it, instead of having to use a third-party program to calculate the best way to reforge your gear to get the perfect amount of hit and stat for every other secondary stat. So they vastly simplified stats in the next expansion, even removing most gem slots and enchants. And at number 2, we have Old World Flying. With the Old World Revamp and Cataclysm came Old World Flying, making the vast expanseness of the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor much easier and faster to navigate. As we briefly mentioned earlier, a ton of new flight paths were also added, making traveling certain parts of the zone from flight paths also much easier. This was incredibly helpful for getting around the world and worked seamlessly into making the new Cataclysm zones feel like a natural part of the continent. While there is some validity to the claim that Old World Flying reduced just how big the vanilla world felt, the usefulness of Old World Flying has so many effects that just overall make for a better experience for most players. Old World Flying made much of the old world more accessible for the average player and encouraged exploration. This, coupled alongside the new Cataclysm quests and updates to the zones, made many old world zones actually feel like completely different zones in their original vanilla iterations. That's not to say that each zone was better after the Cataclysm zone revamp, just that overall, many were. Old World Flying fundamentally changed WoW in its vanilla design, and the overall player experience was better for it, which is why it comes in at second place on our list. And finally at number 1, we have Transmogrification. Although it had its fair share of problems in Cata, T-Mog was added to the game in Cataclysm, and it forever changed the game in character customization and appearance. This is the third system brought by the Ethereals, with the aforementioned Void Storage and Reforging being the other 2. Although it has undergone several changes since Cataclysm, even T-Mog in its infancy completely changed WoW. With Transmogrification, players could now alter their gear's appearance to something more desirable and pleasing to them. We could make an entire video alone on the history of transmog in the game and its ramifications, but all of it started in Cataclysm. The ability to customize the appearance of a player's gear finally heralded the end of the unintentional mismatch hulking monstrosities known as clown suits. The effects of transmog can widely be felt even to this day, where some players play for the sole purpose of collecting transmog and cosmetics. Blizzard even tapped into this by creating the Trial of Style event. One simply cannot escape transmog, and it has become so common and ubiquitous in the game that it definitely deserves the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that does it for this video. I want to go ahead and acknowledge that Cataclysm had tons of problems, but too often people can only remember things that are negative more than things that are positive. Cataclysm was the biggest update in the game's history, and this remains true even a decade later. There are certainly positive elements from the expansion that the game has been bettered by.